Hey friends, thanks for tuning in. Today we're talking about Multisite and particularly this pernicious problem that I like to call the 3-campus ceiling. I want to help you unpack why your church might be stalled at 3 locations and more importantly, where to move from here. You know, I've been involved in Multisite for a very long time, like 2.5 decades, 25 plus years, which seems crazy to me. When we first started doing Multisite, we didn't even call it Multisite. We were just solving a very real problem at our church. Probably the closest thing we called it was video overflow, but it was 45 minutes away. We just would call it that thing over there. And so every week we would produce a video in our weekend service and we would get it over there to that new location. How did we get the video there? Well, that's a story. So we had 2 services at that time. We're about an hour and 15-minute long services, and we would have the 9 o'clock service and the teaching, we'd have music and, announcements, all that stuff. And then the teaching would begin. And then at the end of the service, again, at about 10:15, the guy on the tech booth, and it was often a guy, would hit eject on the SVHS tape. Old school VHS tape. He would hit eject and hand it to another guy that was just outside our back door who was in his car. And then that person would get into their vehicle, and there used to be these video stores out there called Blockbuster. And Blockbuster had these tape rewinders. You'd put the tape in, slam it down, and it would fast rewind the tape. Well, he had jerry-rigged one of those to his car, and as he was speeding down the road, it was about a 45-minute drive. Again, they would start at 11 a.m. in this new location, so there was really no time to spare. This tape rewinder would rewind the tape all the way back to the beginning. Then he would arrive at 11 a.m. and the music would be going. We had some sort of host that was there. We didn't know what to call them. And they would hand that tape to someone in the room who would then press play. It was terrible, but it was the beginning of what we now called Multisite. But looking back at it, what we really were doing was stretching a system far beyond what it was designed to handle. It makes sense to you now that that was not scalable, but at the time we didn't know that. We were just solving a problem. And that's exactly what a lot of our churches are doing today, Multisite churches. We've designed a system that isn't scalable, and we end up at this 3-campus ceiling. And I want to help you unpack that today. What do I mean by the 3-campus ceiling? Well, here it is. 80%, if we were to go out and survey Multisite churches, 80+% of Multisite leadership teams would say that they want to launch more locations. However, 65% of Multisite churches are stuck at a total of 3 locations. What does that mean? Way more churches are out there saying they want to do more locations than are actually doing them today. Most churches don't stop multiplying because they lose vision. They stop because their systems can't support doing it again. So we assume, listen, and I love me some lead pastors. I spent most of my time as an executive pastor or executive pastor adjacent roles. And I love lead pastors, but our assumption, and lots of lead pastors, our assumption is if we just cast a more compelling vision, if we just rally the team, frankly, if we just push harder, we can get these things to launch. And that's not it. The first campus stretches you. The second begins to expose cracks. By the third, you really start to feel the weight. Now, every time that you start talking about launching again, there's a quiet hesitation in the room. You still believe in it. You still believe in multiplication, but you also remember the costs of the last time. And that memory sits in the back of every conversation. So here's really the takeaway for you. 1 to 2 is mostly about courage. 2 to 3 is about more complexity. 3 and beyond, you've got to build systems to really support that. Communication gets harder. Decisions slow down. Costs feel heavier. Relationships between campus and central can become strained. It isn't because you chose to stop. It's because your systems made the decision for you. And so I want to unpack for you what I call the CLEAR framework. It just starts with the first letter of the word clear, C-L-E-A-R. Churches don't break through by wanting to multiply more. They break through by building clearer, more prepared, more repeatable systems. So let's talk through the CLEAR framework, and maybe it will help your team wrestle as you're thinking about Campus 3 and beyond. All right, so C. Clarify, central, and campus. Clarify, campus, and central. Well, here's the core tension. Beyond a couple locations, you are leading what's called a matrix organization. And so, you might be aware of the typical pyramid organization where everybody has a single boss and that all reports up to some grand poobah leader at the top that makes all the decisions. But a matrix organization, which multi-site churches beyond a couple locations are, by definition, have both a central leadership team and a campus leadership team. Now, you maybe haven't formally identified that, but you do have that. There are people that are responsible for things in a particular location, and then there are people that are responsible for things across all your locations. But can I be honest here? We see this relationship getting frayed at 3 and beyond particularly. The relationship between campus and central, though, is not a problem to be solved. It's a tension to be managed. Listen, come close. If you're here today and you've got tension between your campus and central people, you're not doing something wrong. That's literally built into the model. It's a part of a matrix system. And rather than trying to find some easy solution or thinking that there's some easy solution, what you need to understand is that campus teams do something different than central teams. We need to make sure that both sides of this equation are super clear. So central people generally are responsible for systems and curriculum. How do we get this to work across all of our multiple locations? Campus people, they're responsible for people and execution. Who showed up? Are people getting connected? What are we doing with the first-time guests that arrived yesterday to make sure that they feel loved and connected? Friends of mine say it like this: Central writes the play, campus runs the play. So, this can break down in a lot of different places. It's not because you've picked the wrong model, but it's often because you're not clear on A, who is on central and who's on campus, or B, what they're supposed to be doing. And that leads to frustration. It leads to triangulation. It leads to those mom versus dad dynamics. When you were a kid, and if dad said no, then you'd go to mom, or if mom said no, you'd go to dad. Well, people will do that in multi-site. If central says no, then I'll go to my campus leader. If my campus leader says no, then I'll go to my central leader. We've got to make it clear on who is responsible for what. And listen, before we get to who is the boss, because oftentimes these conversations, they degenerate down to, well, but who's responsible? They end up in these power up conversations. Who can fire somebody? Who gets to make the ultimate choice? That sort of thing. And listen, if your church is operating at who gets to make the ultimate choice, who gets to fire somebody kind of language all the time, you've got bigger issues. What we've got to do is build towards clarity and trust. Acknowledge that there is a tension to be managed here, that if this is done well, there still is going to be a tension between campus and central by design. Better questions than who's the boss is who owns this? Who's contributing to this? Who decides? Who is executing on these various issues? I like to call it the Tuesday afternoon test. If your youth pastor, or really any team member in a campus on a random Tuesday afternoon runs into a problem and they don't know who to talk to, you don't have clarity yet. This is a huge issue. You've got to work to get very clear between what are the pieces of the puzzle that central, and I would say systems and curriculum, and campus, I would say people and execution, own. But it's not just, checklist. It's not just what you can fit into paper or maybe into a spreadsheet. There's also the relational work. The churches that have been able to accelerate beyond 5, 6, 7, 10 locations, they understand that there's a relational substrate that happens beneath all of these checklists, and don't skip that. You've got to be investing to ensure that your campus and central people have healthy, strong relationships. When trust is high, this tension is manageable, but when trust is low, this tension becomes conflict. So what do you need to do in the first of these areas to become clear? You need to clarify campus and central. All right, number 2, locate and develop your next leaders. Okay, so I was talking to a prevailing multi-site church recently, and the lead pastor said to me, leaned in and said, listen, Rich, I think we could launch 3 locations in the next year. We've got the locations, we've got the financial resources to do it. I think we can rally the volunteers, but I cannot find campus pastors. I can't find people to lead these things. We can't find the right campus pastor. Listen, friends, lean in, lean in, lean in. 9 out of 10 campus pastors are being found internally. So this is the thing, friends, if you do not have a pipeline of future campus pastors, you do not have a future in multi-site. You've got to build the bench of campus leaders today to get ready for the future. You've got to start working on that today and not waiting for someday for them to start showing up. Listen, you need to be thinking more like a farmer, less like a hunter. I hear too many lead pastors or executive pastors or senior leaders think, where do I find them? And it's like they think, well, I'm going to do a national search. I'm going to look across the country and find these people. No, they're in your backyard. They're in your church today. What you've got to do is create fishing ponds. What do I mean by fishing ponds? Fishing ponds are informal environments where you, as senior leaders, the people that are going to make these decisions around who are these campus pastors, where you can see these people surface. These are leadership book clubs. Each of the people on your lead team, find 10 people in the church and say, hey, we're going to read a book. Let's read this book together, and we'll set up a Slack channel. We can chat about it while we're reading. And at the end of the 3 months, we're going to get together. Put that out to 10 people, see who shows up. Do that for a year. Get the same people through a bunch of groups and start to see who are the leaders that are leading in. Maybe it's quarterly gatherings for high capacity volunteers. Those leaders of leaders already in your church. What if you started to get those people together for some deliberately optional training and see who shows up, see who keeps being a part of those conversations? Again, fishing ponds, places where you are relationally connected with those. And don't forget cohorts of emerging leaders. Listen, all of our churches have to be obsessed with thinking about the next generation. And a campus pastor role is a great role for younger leaders. So what are you doing to connect with leaders in their 20s and 30s? How can you find a way to interact with these kinds of leaders to then raise them up and say, hey, maybe we could see you take step. Listen, the goal of these fishing ponds isn't training, it's observation. How do you know who's ready to lead a campus? They're already leading today. They're doing something where they're leading others today. Who shows up consistently? Who leans in? Who thinks like an owner? Who goes beyond just being kind of the minimal thing? That is where you find your campus pastors. If you don't let people feel the weight of leadership before they become a campus pastor, you're setting them up to struggle later. You've got to give them some responsibility. You've got to do that thing where you say, hey, come and watch me do this thing, and then we'll do it together, and then I'll watch you, and then you go and bring somebody else along with you. So L, locate and develop your next leaders, your next campus leaders particularly. Okay, number 3, E, engineer repeatable launch economics. Engineer repeatable launch economics. So here's the unspoken truth. If you go out and talk to churches where multi-site hasn't worked, the ultimate thing that shuts the thing down is finances. Now, typically what leads up to that is we don't have a large enough launch core teams. We don't have enough kind of engaged volunteers. But the thing that actually pulls it apart in the end is the economics don't work anymore. We frankly can't afford it. But there's lots of ways that these things fall apart financially, emotionally, organizationally. It becomes heavier than we experience. And the experience, really that experience, when it becomes way too heavy, is shaping every decision that you make as an organization. And I know this. Listen, I was a part of launching 13 campuses directly. I've coached a ton of more churches through this. And every time I was launching, I wanted to make sure that we set up the financial side of it so that we were repaying the cost as quickly as possible on the other side. Why? Because I knew that as fast as we did that, that would get us to launching in our next location. If this location cost way too much money, then we would not get to the next location after that. So a couple things to think about. You got to think about the actual location. What do you do? Where do you meet? Don't rent something that's too expensive. Don't build too big. Think about your overall cost structure. Ideally, what you want to shoot for, and we can have more conversation with this if you want to talk about this someday, is that your cost structure is dealt with. You're paying your direct attributable costs with the direct attributable revenue as fast as you possibly can, self-sustaining as fast as you possibly can. And then expectations. You've got to work your people towards reasonable expectations and what this campus is going to, the experience is going to give when you're there. So some simple math to think about, okay, how do we build a budget? You want to start with real numbers, like things that are actually happening at your church. So here's what you can do. First, calculate the giving at your church per person. So what do I mean by that? You take your total giving and divide it by your average attendance. That's your per person giving. Now, what you want to do is estimate your launch size. So typically we see a 3-to-1 ratio. For every one volunteers you send, you'll end up with 3 people attending that campus. So, and that's after, birth and all that, like the longer term, it typically ends up in that range. It's an incredibly sticky rule of thumb that we see. So if you send 100 volunteers, often you'll see that campus be 300 people. Now what you do is you take that average per capita giving and multiply it by the number of people. That is your projected revenue at that location. Now, there's a lot of conversation around that. There's obviously it's more complex than that, but that is a simple starting point for you to think through the revenue side of launching. And the question is, have you set up a model where the campus can operate within that reality? If a healthy model is 50% of your campus costs or your existing costs today are staffing, are you structuring the staffing in this new location to be 50% of that number that we just calculated? And what your program costs are and all of those things. Listen, hope is not a strategy. You can't just say like, oh, we just hope this thing will work and pay for itself. No, you need to start with real numbers to engineer a repeatable launch economics. All right, next one, assemble a repeatable playbook. If you're stuck at 3 locations, one of the things that we see that early on, what we say is when we launch our first location is we send some really entrepreneurial leaders, some maybe apostolic leaders to go make this thing happen. But then we get a couple of them going. And at the beginning, we don't really know what we're doing over there. In fact, actually, that first campus I was telling you about, we literally would call it that thing over there. We didn't even know what to call it. And we sent a great entrepreneurial leader to go make it happen. That works for a season, but that does not scale. You've got to get to the point where the system only worked. You got to get beyond the point where the system only worked because of who was in the room. So you send these initial leaders early on, but you need to move beyond that and get it to the place where it's the people. You build a system that is actually repeatable. And what do I mean by a repeatable playbook? This is like things on paper. It does not need to be 100 pages, but it does need to be a few pages where you define what is your experience. What are the things that make your church your church? So we really got to move from, okay, how did we do that to, okay, what are we going to do next time? And really what you've got to do is define your core non-negotiables. So this is like, what are your non-negotiables around the weekend adult experience? What are the non-negotiables around the guest experience, kids environments, next steps pathways, key processes, brand consistency, these sort of things? Get them on paper. Now, let me give you a little hint, friends. After journey with many multi-site multi-sites over time. At the beginning, when we start these things, we think that this is a very long list, but actually over time, it becomes a narrower list. We get clearer on fewer things long term. So resist the temptation to have a ton of these, resist the temptation to have a super long list, but you do need to actually have a list. You need to work on what is, what our approach is. We know that there's lots of different ways to do church. All we're doing here is trying to define that this is the way we do church. It may not even be the best way, but it is our way. And we think that there's something special about that. All right. And then last, reinforce one church culture. This one, I would say, is the most subtle of all of these and takes the longest journeying as a multi-site leader to really see. It's one of the most important. So we've got to really watch our language. Early on, you need to work to ensure that we're not talking about that campus over there. I used that language even earlier, or saying things like, well, Central made us do this, or their team is doing it differently. Well, it's not their team, it's our team. Or, at the beginning, these kind of subtle things that set up the us and them can seem really subtle and even harmless at the beginning, but it creates distance and it erodes trust and destroys alignment long term. We have to fight for we. One church, different locations, sure, different expressions, one mission, one culture, one team. The moment every campus starts doing what's right in their own eyes, you don't have a multi-site church anymore. You have a loose network of disconnected ministries. And so you've got to become really good at reinforcing the one church culture, ensuring that your people don't use us and them language, that articulate that we are one church in many locations. It's kind of like the old swear jar. If you're a kid and you said a bad word, you had to put some money in there. It's like that. But with this kind of language, we've got to work hard to have clear language. Well, let's go back to where we started, that VHS system. For a while it worked. We did a few weeks of kind of testing. But then what happened on our opening Sunday? They put it into that rewinder thing I talked about, and it rewound all the way back and snapped the original tape. And then our teaching pastor had to jump in their car and drive out there. The system that we designed just didn't work. It broke. And what I'll tell you is, if we aren't clear on who we are, if we aren't clear on what we're trying to do, we won't get beyond 3 locations. All right. So for you, as we wrap up today's conversation, don't just watch this and move on. What I would encourage you to do is to set aside 90 minutes with your leadership team in the next few weeks and walk through this together. Talk about the clear framework. Talk about those 5 things. Where are we clear? Where are we undeveloped? Where are we overextending financially? Where are we relying on heroicism rather than systems? And where do we see our culture drifting? You don't need more vision. That's not what will get you to 3 and beyond. You need a church that's ready to move again. We would love to have you come to Exponential 2027, next year's Exponential. We're going to have a whole track all on multi-site. You can see links in the show notes about that, where we're going to talk about this and many other things. So thanks so much, friends.